you can get Mark's newsletter, Stop the Presses, at stopthepresses.news, along with his video series, Media Misses, with Stephen Beschloss. Mark Jacob, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
All right. So we go to California and what is happening over at the Los Angeles Times. And it's a combination of things. It's politics, obviously. It's, what is the value in a newspaper editorial and a newspaper endorsement in this digital age? But also it's about corporations and money. And as somebody who has worked for the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times, I'm guessing you know a thing or two about tension between journalists and the people who sign their paychecks. So with that in mind, how would you describe to the listeners what has happened this week at the LA Times?
Well, the LA Times was purchased about 6 years ago by a billionaire medical guy, a guy who made a bunch of money in medicine named Patrick Soon-shiong. And he bought the LA Times, and he's done okay with it, but except that it's kind of has had a smaller footprint than it used to, but it's still going. That's a good thing. So the editorial board meets, and they generally endorse Democrats. I mean, California is a blue state, and this year, Pat, there is a lot of reasons to be endorsing Kamala Harris. I would have to say, when you put the two candidates up next to each other. Anyway, so the editorial board at the Los Angeles Times says, yeah, we want to endorse Harris. And Soon-shiong, the owner, says, no, you're not endorsing anyone. We're not going to have an endorsement, and which is very disappointing. A lot of people think that it's what has been called complying in advance or anticipatory obedience, where companies and people bend to a would-be dictator even before he forces them to, in order to protect themselves. And you're starting to see some indications in the news media that rich people and corporations are just trying to stay out of Trump's way by not making him mad in case he wins. And anyway, the good part of this story is that the head of the editorial board of the Los Angeles Times, Mariel Garza, resigned. And so did two other members of the editorial board. They said they couldn't remain silent. They were not going to comply with this, and that's the kind of courage we need in these times. Meanwhile, at the Washington Post, which has been the newspaper, to me, one of the best newspapers covering the election, certainly better than the New York Times, they haven't made an endorsement yet, which is highly curious. And there's starting to be a lot of speculation in the Washington Post newsroom that they're not going to make an endorsement, that the owner, Jeff Bezos, doesn't want Trump to harass his big business, Amazon, and so he may just stay on the sidelines this time. That would be the thing about it, Pat. I question, like you mentioned, I question the value of endorsements for presidents, since people have all the information they need. They don't need a newspaper telling them how to vote. But it's really important for institutions to step up at this time, I think.
Well, especially in light of the fact that some of these institutions' owners have government contracts, and as has been noted here, Bezos doesn't want to risk endangering Amazon's government contracts. You've got Elon Musk, who has all kinds of government contracts, and yet is cozy with Putin and could help or hurt what's happening in Ukraine as a result. So resigning your job as editor of a newspaper, might not necessarily cause, a national chain reaction, but you got to start someplace, and you've got to have people who stand for principle.
Yeah, and you see some of that. I mean, I've been so disappointed in the way that these supposedly mainstream centrist Republican politicians just folded, like a house of cards to Trump. And when you see the few that didn't, just recently you had, you guys had a longtime legislator in Wisconsin, right? Who endorsed Harris.
Rob Coles, yes.
And you have Fred Upton in Michigan, former congressman, Republican congressman. You got it. This happens one person at a time. People need to stand up. You and I are talking right now about how people need to stand up, and we're standing up. And everyone needs to do that. Everyone needs to instead of just like kind of acting as if you don't have any control over what's happening in our society, if everyone does something, you do have control of your society.
Well, that gets us to CNN and whatever their business model is now for having talking heads on. And I've never seen it, but of course I'm always on social media, so there's always clips of this guy named Scott Jennings. And the outrageous things that he's saying, which are so patently untrue frequently, and the other panelists call him out on it. But again, that's a talk show. That's
Right.
hardly news analysis when you're coddling and continually giving a platform to somebody who is spreading misinformation. Am I wrong in saying there's a difference between what your editorial output looks like?
Yeah, well, I think to a large extent that's entertainment. They
Yeah.
they want to have a bunch of people yelling at each other over a table. And they think that's going to entertain people. One thing that's really important to emphasize is it's not just that CNN is giving Scott Jennings a platform; they're paying him to do that.
Wow.
And for years, CNN has hired crazy right wingers. And again, I've said this before on your show. Conservatives, fine. Be an ideological conservative. I respect that. Everyone has their opinions, and that's great. It's liars that bother me.
Yeah.
So, and Scott Jennings is like, trying to minimize the fact that Trump likes Hitler is, that's really a pretty untenable position, but he's taking it. And you know why he's taking it? Because CNN hired him to take it. CNN, and there's a long history of people they've hired in the past to do that same job, to have that same role where you're the right winger who argues with the left wingers or the centrists, and therefore you have a spirited conversation on TV.
Well, and guess what? I'm about to show an example of the opposite, and I'm going to have to plead guilty to this. Now, I've never watched this show on Fox called The Five, I think it's called, but I do frequently see social media posts because they have one progressive on there. I think Jessica Tarlov. Am I saying her name right?
I think that's right.
Again, I've never watched the show, but when I see the clips of her takedowns of all the other conservatives around her are masterful. They're rooted in fact. But of course, she's not changing any of their minds. She's not changing any minds of the Fox viewers. And yet I enjoy seeing that in much the same way I'm sure Republicans enjoy seeing Scott Jennings. The difference is one's rooted in fact and the other's rooted in fiction. But I guess in some ways I'm kind of confessing that I'm glad there's somebody there calling things out. I'd rather have that than one person on there who they always have to correct because he's spewing misinformation.
Yeah, but see, this is my argument: is that if you're a news show, go find a conservative who's actually telling the truth. And I mean, you can argue for abortion. You can argue for we don't need universal health care. You can argue we need a balanced budget. We need to not spend money on X and Y and Z. Those are all legitimate opinions, and you can find conservatives to say that if you try hard enough. Instead, they keep on platforming the liars. And I think there's a concerted effort among the Republican Party to put the same old liars on the big news shows. Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, Mike Johnson. You see those on the Sunday news shows all the time. And I think it's because the Republicans, I don't know this because nobody will explain it to us, but I think that the Republican Party is saying, take it or leave it. This is who you get. And if the news shows would try harder to find legitimate, honest conservatives, we'd have a less toxic news environment.
Well, I think that's what they have to do is okay, fine. We can't get it in the Senate. Look in the House. We don't have them in the House. Here's somebody. Here's a leading legislator from Maryland who is speaking out about this because there was a time, and it wasn't all that long ago, when Republicans, like Democrats, all Americans, wanted to solve problems, which meant you'd have to build things or create programs. But now the entire philosophy of conservatism isn't to solve problems efficiently, but to actually just shrink government for the sake of shrinking government.
Right.
And
make it
so
less efficient.
Right. So that when they're faced with things that would actually take the spending of money, I know inside it kills some of them, but they can't. They the orthodoxy is you can't spend $1 more than you are right now. And that takes away any purpose whatsoever in solving problems or helping people.
Well, but Pat, it's also not just how much you're spending; it's how much you're taking in. And the big motive, I think, the number one motive of the Republican Party right now is to give giant tax cuts to rich people, because rich people will give them money for their campaigns. It's this kind of this perpetual motion machine where the rich people give Republicans big bucks, and the Republicans give big bucks back to the rich people.
So now we're getting to the point of the election where, and I'm already seeing the headlines out here of how they think things will finish. And I mean, can we be honest? Nobody knows how it's going to finish yet. So I don't know why. Again, we're still talking about the race and not the stakes. But you see it in Axios, you see it in Politico, you see it in all of the media houses out here. You know, there's still enough time to talk about what's at stake, either issue by issue or, democracy itself.
Right.
But they just can't quit the polls.
Oh no, it's all, it's horse race, and it's also just like Axios has a horrible, cheap story up today that says leading Democrats are telling us privately that they feel that Harris is going to lose. Well, all right. And they say a growing number. Well, what's that growing number? Like they talked to 3 people yesterday and it was 2 people last week. Well, I mean, it's absurd. And also, if you know politics, Pat, people gossip in politics. That's what they do. Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure we put enough money there. I think we put too much money there. We should have campaigned there. It's all about second guessing and speculation. That's what the whole industry is about. So you can certainly write a story saying there are a lot of people who have misgivings, because they always do.
Right. I mean, that's a dog bites man headline if ever. And since we haven't picked on any headlines, let's pick on one of them from the New York Times that says, Trump flirts with the ultimate tax cut, no income taxes at all. Now, buried in the story is how the idea is mathematically impossible and economically destructive. But why a headline that just focuses on flirting with something that would be harmful instead of actually saying Trump promotes something that is harmful?
This is a great mystery to me, and I used to write headlines for a living, and the New York Times headlines are way worse than their stories. If you read their stories, you kind of understand things a little bit, but their headlines are often really misleading, and they just tend to fuzz the issues. Like they tend to not blame the people who are responsible for stuff. Although I don't even know why you wrote the story they wrote the way they did, because this idea that, well, maybe we don't need any income tax. Oh, please, of course we need income tax. And the only way we wouldn't need income tax is if Trump's giant fantasy that tariffs are a tax on other countries was true. And it's not. And nobody thinks that. No experts on the right or the left think that.
No,
it's totally invented.
And here's the other one. Let's see, who did this one come from? Where it says Harris uses ex-Trump chiefs of staff remarks to paint him as unfit for office. Well, it's not Harris using the remarks that should be the headline. Right. It's that Trump's ex-chief of staff is making these remarks.
Right. And it's like, well, Harris is painting him as a fascist. No, his former longtime chief of staff and Homeland Security secretary is calling him a fascist. So is his former defense secretary. I mean, these are people who should know because they were in meetings with him. Right. And to say, well, this is a big political issue. It's not political tactic. It's a really scary fact or opinion by somebody who really should know that Trump says fascist things. That's what we should worry about. Not this is an interesting tactic.
Exactly. So that was the Wall Street Journal, by the way. Mark Jacob, appreciate it once more before the election. Have a good weekend. We'll see you later.
Talk to you later.
All right.